Well, I'm Lee Goodman. I'm chairman of the Federal Election Commission, and I'm here to help. And that's true. I'm here to protect your First Amendment rights. The Federal Election Commission is a federal agency composed of 6 commissioners, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats by law, so that one side doesn't get to call the balls and strikes of the game. And I can, on behalf of my 2 fellow Republican commissioners, Matt Peterson and Caroline Hunter, I can tell you that because it takes 4 votes to take any regulatory action at the Federal Election Commission, the 3 of us are the dam protecting your First Amendment freedoms. And we take that role very seriously. And I'm not offended in the least if the New York Times criticizes me on its editorial page. I have 2 children. I raised them to be open-minded. I raised them to consider different perspectives, and I don't steer them toward my own right now. I want them to grow up and determine their own thoughts on actions. But occasionally they teach me something, and most recently they took me to a movie called Divergent. I didn't read the book growing up. It was published in 1993, but it immediately I realized that the film had very important libertarian themes. And most important of it was, in Divergent, there is a utopian community where people are immunized against free choice, immunized against emotion, because, as the head of their community says, people always choose wrong. And an important component of maintaining this utopia is controlling the language that people can use, because if you don't control the language, you do not control thought, you do not control ideas, you do not control the culture. This is also a theme that George Orwell featured in 1984. Everyone was required to speak newspeak. And this is not just some science fiction story. Look at college campuses today, where political correctness has run amok, and commencement speakers are disinvited because they do not want diversity of thought on their campuses. Rather than listen, consider contrary opinions, they would rather banish the speech and the ideas that are expressed in that speech altogether. That's far easier than meeting the merits of a concept or a speaker. So we know that what distinguishes America from totalitarian regimes is fundamentally the First Amendment, which is the first freedom on which all of our other freedoms are based. And it is critical that we have the freedom of speech to share ideas in the marketplace of ideas so that everyone can hear and think for themselves and decide for themselves. So imagine a campaign finance and speech regulatory regime that is designed to create a debate where there is but one podium in the debate. That is a debate where if I'm the one standing at the podium, I can win every time. And for 35 years in the United States, from 1974 to 2010, that was the prevailing policy of our United States government. Beginning in 1974, Congress enacted laws that absolutely banned labor unions, business corporations, and nonprofit corporations from expressing an opinion in elections. And then in 2002, Congress enacted another law, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, also known as McCain-Feingold, that extended the ban on labor unions, business corporations, and nonprofit corporations from even engaging in issue speech within 60 days of an election, right when everyone was focused on public affairs. They were told, you cannot fund messages in the public and over the public airwaves that criticize public officials within 60 days of an election. Even if a vote is coming up in Congress on the eve of an election, you cannot criticize them over the airwaves. Our Supreme Court righted that ship beginning in 2007 in a case called Wisconsin Right to Life versus Federal Election Commission, and they freed corporations and labor unions to run those issue ads within 60 days of an election and clarified that these are issue ads, we cannot ban them. And then in 2010, in the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission decision, the the Supreme Court recognized that people form associations to speak, and they do not shed their First Amendment rights just because they incorporate their association. The result of those two twin decisions is we have opened up more speech in the democracy. People hear more opinions, particularly about free market ideas, lower taxes, limited government. Those are the opinions and the ideas that are expressed when we open up the marketplace to corporations and freedom-loving corporations, nonprofits, to speak. It's good for people to hear more points of view. It's good for democratic discourse, to add diversity in what we hear, and it affords us more competitive politics and more competitive policy debates where the best idea can win. Now, those people who prefer more regulation of speech and prefer to banish certain speakers and their ideas from the public debate are very frustrated with those decisions. You can barely pick up a newspaper today without reading about the controversy about what the democratic effects of Citizens United. You heard from Senator Cruz last night about efforts to amend the First Amendment in light of the Citizens United decision, which would have given Congress and state legislators broad power to ban certain speech from the democracy. Where else is it occurring? Out of frustration, the IRS has begun targeting certain groups with disfavored points of view if they have the name Patriot or T in their name. Efforts are ongoing to ban certain speakers and certain ideas from the public debate at the Securities and Exchange Commission by requiring greater disclosure by corporations to their shareholders of their political expenditures, and at the Federal Communications Commission, where people are trying to use the licenses that are granted by the FCC to condition the use of those licenses on greater outing of who is running ads. And at the Federal Election Commission, where I work, theories abound on how to put this genie of speech back into the government bottle. This is the debate you hear now, and it is called the dark money debate. And when you read about the dark money debate, I want you to understand about what the legal paradigm underlying the dark money debate is all about. Fundamentally, the so-called pejorative dark money debate is an effort by those who want to regulate more speech, to use the power of government, to reach further into issue advocacy and the private associational rights of issue advocacy organizations to disclose all of their members and donors when they engage in issue advocacy. But bear with me while I walk you through the legal paradigm on which this debate takes place in the Commission. In 1976, in a Supreme Court decision called Buckley versus Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court instructed the Federal Election Commission that there are limits on our jurisdiction. Congress had said that the FEC had jurisdiction to regulate organizations as political committees that's a key legal term, political committee, if they spend over $1,000 on expenditures to expressly advocate the election or defeat of candidates or contributions to candidates or parties. And the Supreme Court said that's not enough. Just because an issue advocacy organization spends $1,000 doesn't mean that the Federal Election Commission gets full regulatory authority over that group as a political committee, because if it's a political committee, they have to register with the Federal Election Commission. They have to disclose every contributor, every dime in, every dime out. That's quite a burdensome regulatory overlay. And so the Supreme Court said there is a limit on your jurisdiction, Federal Election Commission. The organization must have a major purpose of influencing elections. The Supreme Court reiterated this rule in 1986 in a case called Massachusetts Citizens for Life v. Federal Election Commission. And then the Supreme Court said again, you have no general jurisdictional authority over issue advocacy organizations. You only get that regulatory jurisdiction if their major purpose is influencing elections, that is activity that unambiguously influences elections, and only if the organization's spending becomes so extensive on independent expenditures expressly advocating the election or defeat of candidates, and otherwise you have no jurisdiction over those organizations. You only have a very limited form of jurisdiction, which is to require issue advocacy organizations to file limited expenditure-specific reports when they do run express advocacy ads. Well, those organizations have countervailing First Amendment rights of association. From the days of Publius, where there was a group of writers, of founders, who formed an association to urge passing of the Constitution, to the 1950s and 1960s, when southern cities would require the NAACP to first disclose their donor list and membership list before they could get a license to march in a city, to a Supreme Court decision in 1986 where a soul lady named Mrs. McIntyre wanted to pass out leaflets expressing her opinion, encouraging people to vote a certain way on a school bond referendum. In all of those cases, the Supreme Court recognized a right to privacy in speech and a right to privacy of association. And the Supreme Court has told us you do not surrender those rights merely because you make occasional electoral expenditures. Congress has provided a reporting construct for those occasional expenditures. Well, this is obviously a point of friction now post-Citizens United. And the latest, most creative argument of those who want to regulate speech more is to expand the definition of major purpose. Yes, we understand the Supreme Court told us our regulatory jurisdiction only extends to organizations that have the major purpose of influencing elections. So the newest, greatest theory of the regulate speech crowd is, let's include issue advocacy in the count toward an organization's major purpose. And we are deadlocked 3-3 on that issue at the Federal Election Commission. We have deadlocked in 3 consecutive cases this year, and I'm facing 2 federal lawsuits by the pro-regulatory crowd challenging my legal position in this case. First, I welcome the judicial review. I have the courage of my convictions and the courage of our position. I welcome the judicial review, and fundamentally, those who want to regulate speech more face 2 fundamental constitutional problems. First, the courts have told us we have no regulatory jurisdiction over issue advocacy, so you cannot count a group's issue advocacy toward its major purpose to bootstrap regulatory jurisdiction. And secondly, an issue advocacy organization, we've been consistently told, does not have to surrender its associational freedoms, including the confidences of the members who constitute the association, just because it spends $1,000 to exercise its free speech rights recognized in Citizens United. Now, so what's the purpose of those who want to regulate speech and control speech and ideas in our society now by forcing more groups into the definition of political committee and forcing them to disclose all their donors? Well, I think Saul Alinsky said it. If you use the power of government to expose those people and identify those people, then those who disagree with them will use that power of government to then vilify them and try to push them out of the public debate. Saul Alinsky said, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Cut off the support network and isolate the target from sympathy. Go after people and not institutions. People hurt faster than institutions. And if you watch C-SPAN and you watch daily debates on the floor of the United States Senate, you hear the name David Koch and Charles Koch mentioned and vilified on a weekly basis on the floor of the United States Senate. If you support free market ideas, if you support social conservative ideas, if you're for energy independence, if you have the name T in your name, you'll be the subject of criticism, protest, boycotts. And let me tell you, I agree that all of those counteractions to speech are exercises of First Amendment freedom too. But the problem is those critics want to use the power of government to force these people to disclose all of their members. So it is the use of government power to facilitate the banishment of these people and these speakers and their ideas from the public debate that I object to. Now, we disclose a lot of political expenditures at the Federal Election Commission. In the 2012 cycle, $7.3 billion in electoral expenditures were publicly disclosed through the Federal Election Commission. About 3 to 4% of that total was spent by issue advocacy groups that disclosed their expenditures but did not disclose who their members and donors were because that was part of their freedom of association. 7 million of that amount, it was about $300 million. 7 million of that was spent by Planned Parenthood and Planned Parenthood affiliated organizations. I think that's great. I'm glad Planned Parenthood participated in democratic discourse and expressed their ideas and held their ideas up to debate, but I haven't heard one bit of criticism about who the donors of Planned Parenthood are. I dare say that the membership and donor base of Planned Parenthood would be highly sensitive to public disclosure. And it happens on the right end of the spectrum too, especially in the social issues. But nobody is criticizing them. They're criticizing the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They're criticizing free enterprise groups, saying that they're drowning out other voices. Isn't it far preferable to let that speech be heard and let that speech be debated on the merits rather than vilifying the speakers and trying to push people out of the public square? So when you hear the dark money debate, I want you to understand it in context. It is an effort by those who want to regulate speech more, to alter the playing field of speech and banish speech using government power, and nothing more. Now, what else am I fighting for at the Federal Election Commission? This year, we had occasion to endorse the free use of Bitcoins in campaigns and elections. One of my aides, Gary Lukowski, is over here. I must admit, I did not know what a Bitcoin was when it first walked in as an issue at the Federal Election Commission. But I have a libertarian aide in Gary Lukowski. We call him Bitcoin Gary. And so one night he gave me an economic treatise to take home, and I read it, and I came in the next day and I said, we're going to endorse the use of Bitcoins. It is not that novel a concept to have an alternative medium of exchange. And the Federal Election Commission has allowed and endorsed all sorts of in-kind contributions. Over the years, you can give a campaign a piece of art. You can walk in with computers. We've approved securities, bonds and securities being given to campaigns. So long as the campaign receives it and reports who gave them the donation, there is nothing fundamentally and paradigmatically different about a Bitcoin. It is something of value, and we endorsed its use, but I can tell you the first time it walked in the door, that issue split 3-3. 3 Republican commissioners endorsed its use, 3 Democratic commissioners opposed its use. It came in the door a second time, and finally, they saw the light. We got 6 votes to approve it. However, my 3 Democratic colleagues said, but only up to $100. And I said, oh no, and I issued a statement, and I said, Bitcoins are like any other contribution. They can be given to the full limit of $2,600 per election. Just report them, and now we see campaigns using them, and there are not 4 votes to stop them at the Federal Election Commission. I want to tell you another one. We had a progressive group, a vendor of progressive groups come in called Revolution Messaging. They work for labor unions, progressive groups. And the vendor puts banner ads on cell phones. And the banner ads come across the top. They're fairly small, or they come across the bottom. And the banner ads are so small they will not accommodate the required disclaimers of who paid for them and leave any room for any message. Well, the Federal Election Commission has a small items exemption. We recognize that some items do not accommodate that disclaimer, and to print the disclaimer will squeeze out all room for the speech. And so the Federal Election Commission recognizes that if you print up pens like this, there's no required disclaimer. Okay, that's been the law a long time. So the group comes in and says, we're a small item. We're a small strip on the screen of this cell phone. Can we run those messages to the public on cell phones and be free of your disclaimer? To print the disclaimer will squeeze out our message. It is speech prohibitive. 3 Republicans said yes, and I held this up in a meeting and I said, this is bigger than your ad here. If this is a small item, this is a small item. And we split 3-3 on that issue. And this was a progressive group that worked for Democratic organizations. And we asked them, is requiring the disclaimer going to ban your speech? And they said yes. So that's an example, because they cannot put those banner ads up with the disclaimer. An entire medium of communication banned because of a myopic application of disclaimer rules. An issue I've spoken out a lot about this year because I care deeply about it is free press rights. When I first came to the commission, we had a case in which WCVB-TV of Boston had decided in its newsroom to host a joint appearance of 2 candidates. They excluded a 3rd candidate. The 3rd candidate was upset and filed a complaint with the Federal Election Commission saying that because he was excluded, that the TV station did not comply with Federal Election Commission rules for corporate-sponsored debates by applying neutral, objective criteria for who they chose. And that's in a regulation of the Federal Election Commission. And I said, wait a minute. There is a free press clause in the First Amendment, and there is an explicit media exemption in the Federal Election Campaign Act passed by Congress. We have no jurisdiction over this television station and their exercise of their newsroom discretion to host two candidates on a regular Sunday morning news program. And I lost that vote 3-3, and instead our commission proceeded to adjudge the newsroom criteria by which they chose the two candidates. The commission did dismiss the case, but I thought it was offensive that we exercised regulatory jurisdiction at all. And I think it is very ominous when the Federal Election Commission begins to ignore the Free Press Clause of the Constitution and the media exemption in our statute that Congress wrote for us, and begins to regulate newsrooms and newspapers and book publishers. And the issue came up again recently when Paul Ryan came to the commission. He has a new book out. And they asked the question, Grand Central Publishing in New York is the publisher of the book. As a publisher of books, including many political books, is Grand Central Publishing exempt from regulation by the Federal Election Commission? 3 commissioners said yes, you have free press clause rights as a book publisher, and 3 said no. About 2 weeks ago, I was quoted in the New York Times explaining why we have some 3-3 deadlocks on the commission. And that when we have 3-3 deadlocks, it means that the tie goes to the speaker. And a few days later, the New York Times editorial page criticized me and said, Goodman says the tie goes to the speaker, which may sound good and civil libertarian, but what it really means is that money is speech and the rich get to speak more than everybody else. And I started to write, and then I just said it wasn't something I wanted to do, but I wanted to ask the New York Times, what if I said you have free press rights, New York Times, but you can't spend any money to run your printing presses to disseminate your message? And I imagine there would be a double standard. Something else we're fighting for, Citizens United ruled that about 4 pages of the FEC's Code of Federal Regulations, those are the regulations we issue, about 4 pages are unconstitutional. And do you know those 4 pages of regulations are still in the Code of Federal Regulations today? The Federal Election Commission has resisted the Constitution of the United States as interpreted by the Supreme Court for 4 years, continue to spend taxpayer money to publish regulations that we know are unconstitutional, patently unconstitutional, no doubt about it. So on October 9, next month, we will call a vote at the Federal Election Commission to remove 4 pages of unconstitutional regulations and to discharge our constitutional obligation. So let me wrap up. The people have a right to hear all perspectives. And I'm not afraid of when the people hear whatever perspective is disseminated. Because the people are not sheep, time and time again. The people who spend more money in elections do not necessarily win. Ask Eric Cantor. Or ask Mitt Romney, because the Sunlight Foundation did an analysis of all those independent expenditures by conservative groups after the 2012 election, and many of those conservative groups had return on investment, meaning they were successful less than 5 to 10% of the time in most cases. It wasn't our year, perhaps. But the people had a right to hear it nonetheless, and the speakers had a right to speak it. The people are not sheep. The people can choose whether to listen to those messages or not. I can tell you, I often flip the channel when the political commercials come on. I have a right to listen to it or not. Sometimes the direct mail comes and I throw it away. I don't even open it. But it's my choice. The people have a right to listen to it and be persuaded by it if they so choose. And they have the intelligence to resist messages that they don't agree with. The people have a right to go vote based on those messages and be influenced by them if they so choose. And the people ultimately vote and choose our elected officials, informed by a robust marketplace of ideas. I've been at the Federal Election Commission now for 1 year. People sometimes ask me, what's been your greatest insight now that you're on the inside instead of just representing groups from the outside? And I must tell you, many of the cases we get are fairly close calls on the subtle legal principles at issue. And I realize that the line between free speech and censorship is a very fine and fragile and delicate line. And you have one seat on the Supreme Court and one seat on a 6-member Federal Election Commission holding their fingers in the dike to protect free speech rights against an over-intrusive government. And as for me, I want to assure all of you liberty-minded people, I will always be guided by the Constitution, and I will always err on the side of freedom. Thank you very much.